Today we are going to be taking a look at Ableton from a beginner's perspective. I remember that 10 years ago when I opened up Ableton Live, I was confused, overwhelmed, and I was honestly blocked creatively because of my understanding of the software. And so today I want to address the beginners who are just starting off with Ableton Live and give you some of the tips that I wish that I would have had. Before we actually get into the software, I want to talk about what a digital audio workstation or a DAW that Ableton is, what that is by definition. And so by definition, it's just a software that allows us to process MIDI and audio. And when we think about it like that, Ableton Live is nothing more than a MIDI and audio processor. It's a very advanced one. There's a lot of awesome features, but if we consider that there's just two sources, MIDI and audio, it makes our life a lot easier. So what is MIDI? Well, MIDI is just a computer protocol that we use to send messages as musicians. Now let's talk about audio. I like to use an example of a video that has frames per second that basically combines images to make the video. Now audio has a similar idea. It uses snapshots of a signal at a particular interval, a sample rate, to record samples. And the bit depth describes the dynamic range that was available to the sampling algorithm. So basically, it's a range between the lowest and highest available signal that can be sampled. So at the end of the day, MIDI is like a set of instructions for creating music, while audio is the implementation or the sound that those instructions produce when they're executed by a hardware or software. So now that we're clear there, let's jump into Ableton and start by just setting up our preferences. You can go to Option Settings, and for just about everything in Ableton, there's an associated keyboard shortcut. I'm not going to cover them all. There's way too many, but you can normally find them if you poke around. So here in the settings, we're just going to do enough to get us up and running. So we need audio coming in and we need audio coming out. And we'd also need to configure our MIDI. So let's start with our driver type. If you don't have an audio interface, you're going to want to use ASIO, but I do have an audio interface, so we'll keep it here at MME DirectX. And then you can find your audio input interface and audio output interface. So we discussed the definition of a sample rate, and it's fine to just leave it at 44.1. That's kind of an industry standard, and that'll do for our purposes. Now, next we'll talk about the buffer size, and this is actually really important. This is going to affect how your PC runs. So basically, we have this test tone, and we can emulate the computer usage that we might experience. So if you load up a lot of things into Ableton, a lot of sounds, your CPU usage is going to bump. So here we can emulate it to see how live will react. Basically, the buffer size relates to the signal coming back from Ableton to the speaker or the headphones, or coming into Ableton from a microphone. There's got to be some time to make that conversion, and so we set that with an input and an output buffer size. When you're recording, the input buffer size is going to want to be low because you don't want to record latency into your track. You can put it higher when you're not recording to save a little bit of CPU power, but play around with your rig, use this test tone. When this thing starts, see, you can hear it kind of wigging out. When it starts having those artifacts, you know that your CPU is being used too intensely. So now let's quickly make sure that our MIDI is configured. If you have a MIDI controller, you'll be able to find it here. Today I'm going to be using the Push 2. Alright, so now that we've got the preferences out of the way, let's go ahead and actually open up a new live set so that you can see exactly what you're going to be getting yourself into. We have MIDI and we have audio. We also have these things over here. We have the master channel or the main, and we have these returns and sends. So let's go ahead and delete those returns and sends, and also delete one of the MIDIs and one of the audios so that we're really down to the bare bones. Now, navigating live, you're going to have a few different windows. Here we can see our main workstations. We have the session view, which is great for live performances, and it really acts as a creative workspace for auditioning ideas quickly in the form of clips. And we'll talk about clips more in a moment, but coming to the arrangement view, we have a timeline where we can put clips in a timeline sequence. Now, clips are not the same in the arrangement and the session. You can drag clips from the arrangement to the session, but they are not the same. And to demonstrate that, let's just record an audio clip really quick. So here we can configure our inputs and outputs at the mixer, and if you don't see this, you should come here to your mixer, and you can also drop down to configure the inputs and outputs here. So now I'm going to receive audio from channel 1, and if I put this on to in, we'll be able to hear my actual voice. But we don't want that right now, so we'll just record, arm this, turn the monitor to off, and now we are recording a clip. So this clip is actually live recording. We can double click on that to see that our voice is recording. We can come up here to stop. These main controls work for both the session and the arrangement view. And now let's go ahead and drag this clip into the actual arrangement view. Now you can see that the arrangement view is grayed out right now because we were just working in the session view. And because they're different workspaces, we're going to need to select this button back to the arrangement view. So now we can work in the arrangement view and we have our audio clip. We can navigate the timeline up here nicely with this little zoom in, zoom out, go left and right to move about the cabin. We can drag clips, we can split clips. You can pretty much do everything with a right click. Here you can see all of your keyboard shortcuts. Control E to split. We can rename this with Control R. If we want to put this clip back together, we have Control J, and we've just consolidated. So there's a lot of clip editing that you can actually do in the arrangement view. This is where I spend a majority of my time. So now, just like recording audio, we can also record MIDI. So if we come over here to our MIDI channel and we record arm this, I can come over to my push and you can see that I am triggering something, but no sound is happening. So let's actually just record, and I don't want to hear my voice anymore. So let's delete that and let's just start a new recording with this record button, trigger some clips. Yeah, we'll just go crazy. And you can see that we actually do have note information in there. Now, unfortunately, we can't hear anything because we haven't rigged up some kind of device to convert this MIDI to audio. And that's where the browser comes in. So on this top left, we can navigate to our browser and we can actually see that we have instruments. Now, all of these instruments are MIDI instruments. You can click on them to preview. You can turn off the preview alternatively there and go through them. Also, what's new to Live 12 is that we have this find similar option, which will find sounds similar to the one that you search. So obviously I just played a bunch of pads. This isn't going to sound too good, but yeah, we can drag this instrument on here. We actually don't want to be using the in. We'll just change the track monitor back to auto, and we will be able to hear our new sound. And so just like the audio clip, we can manipulate this in many different ways as we see fit and arrange it on the timeline as necessary. Now, I'm sure you've seen the bottom portion of this screen light up here when we click on an audio or MIDI clip, and that just gives us some more information. You can see here we have an actual piano roll where we can manipulate the MIDI clips, and the same thing for audio. If we come back here, and actually let me get my voice back and we double click on this, you can see here we have some audio. There are some things called warp markers that we can insert, a whole bunch of cool stuff that you can do with audio, but you don't really need to worry about that as a beginner. If you would like to see some more advanced features, I have a whole 6.5+ hour course where I go in depth into all the different warping modes available and some really advanced awesome features. So check that out if you want to dive a little deeper there, but this is enough to get you started. Alright, so now I want to talk about drum racks. In my opinion, drum racks are by far some of the coolest parts of Ableton Live. If we come in here to the drum tabs, we have this empty drum rack. We can drag and drop this to load an empty track. Now, alternatively, you can right click to insert an audio track, insert a MIDI track, or a return track. And we'll just take a moment to talk about return tracks. You can see that once I inserted this, we got this little additional parameter on our drum rack track, and if we had another track, you'd see we'd also have that parameter. And so if we add a return track, we'd get another one. And so basically this is an inbuilt Ableton Live routing feature. And so what you're meant to do is put effects on these return tracks, audio effects, we'll talk about them shortly, and then you can route different signals and different amounts of that signal to the actual return track. So we've loaded in an empty drum rack, and you can see we have different pads here. And if I go over to my push, you can see I can trigger these different pads on my push. So now I'll actually show you how we can load up some sounds. So I'm going to add a folder from my personal desktop. I have this samples folder. Let's go ahead and quickly load up some sounds. Let's load up that one. I like this one as well. And we'll just build a very quick little kit here. And so this is an interesting bisection of MIDI and audio, because you can see here that this was a MIDI track. We loaded a drum rack onto a MIDI track, and if we're to right click here and go insert empty MIDI clip, you can see that this is a MIDI clip, and we can actually put notes here that correspond to our kick and snare. So see, now we can just make a quick pattern. Let's go ahead and loop this track by using Control L, and we can actually expand the loop button. Here you can see this is the loop on and off, so now our clip will play in a loop. And we can go ahead and manipulate these like so. I'll Control D to take everything. Notice here that we've selected the time. If we were to select only the clips, that would only duplicate the clips, but you can also select time and duplicate whatever this blue range has selected. So that's a nice little trick there. So quickly you can build up a track, and you saw that we could double click here. Alternatively, you can press B on your computer keyboard and you can enter draw mode, and you can right click to enter different subdivisions of the grid to draw bigger or smaller MIDI notes. And then something that I like to do is exit draw mode, select every other one by holding the shift key, come down here, and we can edit the velocity. So quickly we can just add a little bit of a pattern. And I actually copied those onto a kick, so let's go ahead and fix that. We can select all the notes by clicking here in this piano roll and then dragging them down. Cool, so here we're editing the actual MIDI notes. We can come back down here to switch between the notes and the actual devices that are loaded up. And now let's talk a little bit about devices. So here you can see we have this drum rack, and the drum rack is actually a device that can load samples, and actually it's this sampler or simpler instrument that actually loads the samples, and it actually creates its own chain. So within this chain, we can go ahead and add other effects that only affect that specific chain. So you'll see what I'm saying here in a minute. So here we have this kick selected, and let's go ahead and go into our audio effects. So let's just drag on a drum bus to the end of this chain. Notice how I'm inside the actual drum rack chain, but I can drag it outside. So if I drag it outside, this drum bus is actually affecting the entire drum rack. Now what we can do is alternatively drag it inside of this chain to only affect the kick, and you can see as I select different samples, they do not have the drum bus loaded up. And if I pull up the mixer here, come back to the mixer, you can see that I can actually expand this drum rack, and it will give me channels for each of these, and I can do the same thing there, but this is just a quick little way to access each of the individual channels. Now, we went over return tracks. This is a very simple routing feature, but now let's take a look at something called resampling. So we can actually create a new audio track, select resample, select auto, and then we can go back to our drum rack and select to audio. And this is where we're sending the actual audio. So if we check it out, when we play it, we actually don't hear anything anymore. And that's because we are sending the audio to this audio track and we don't have it record armed. If we record arm this, so you can see now we have the level. So what I'm gonna go ahead and do now is start recording, and you can see that we're actually recording this drum track right in. Turn off loop. So we have our MIDI version and our audio version. And if we have multiple tracks, you can imagine you can send them all to a single audio track, and then you can be resampling yourself. So I'm just going to select this drum loop so that we can export it and put it into our sample pack. You know, I'm releasing the sample pack once we hit 3K subscribers. So be sure to like and subscribe if you made it to the end, and don't miss out on that sample pack. So what we'll do is we'll come over here to File, Export Audio/Video. And we've got a couple different options. For me, I'm going to want the main track, and here we have the start and render length. We already set that because we highlighted it, and so Live will automatically put that in there for us. That's really nice. We can also choose to render this as a loop. We're not going to want to convert it to mono. Normalize, we're just going to leave off because the wave looks pretty good. 44.1 is our sample rate that we're going to export to, which is fine. And the analysis file is just for Live. It creates accompaniment file that basically gives Live any timing information that's involved. We'll do PCM. We want our file type to be wave, and our bit depth is going to be 24. And we can also encode an MP3. So this is going to give us a wave file and an MP3. We'll go ahead and export that. And so here you can see I have our drum loop tutorial.wave, and then we also have the MP3. And so I hope you all found this useful. This should be enough to get you up and running with Ableton Live. If you'd like to see more videos on Live, I have that entire 6.5+ hour course on Ableton where you will learn the ins and the outs. I'm also working on something for the Ableton Push 2, which in my opinion is still a very valid controller in 2024. I think